It was a bright, sunny morning when the Johnson family arrived in Maplewood Heights, a picture-perfect neighborhood with rows of manicured lawns, picket fences, and a sense of suburban tranquility. From the outside, it seemed like the perfect place to start anew. Michael Johnson, a respected police captain, had worked tirelessly to give his family this fresh start. With his wife, Rachel, and their two children, Maya and Jordan, the Johnsons were ready to embrace this new chapter of their lives. As the moving truck unloaded their belongings, the Johnsons smiled and waved to the occasional passerby. There was a palpable excitement as they imagined barbecues, block parties, and the sense of belonging they hoped to find here. Rachel, always the optimist, suggested they organize a welcoming barbecue to introduce themselves to the community. "Let's bring everyone together," she said with her usual enthusiasm. Michael nodded in agreement. It was the kind of gesture that had defined them as a family, a desire to connect, to share, and to build bridges. The following weekend, the Johnsons set up a barbecue in their backyard. The smell of grilled meat and laughter filled the air as neighbors trickled in. It was a warm and inviting scene. Kids playing tag, adults chatting over plates of food, and music adding a festive rhythm to the evening. The Johnsons had done their best to make everyone feel at home, and for a while, it seemed they had succeeded. Yet, not everyone was as thrilled about their arrival. Mrs. Thompson, a longtime resident and self-appointed gatekeeper of Maplewood Heights, observed the event from her window with a mixture of disdain and suspicion. In her eyes, the Johnsons' presence disrupted the status quo. She had seen many families come and go over the years, but something about this family, perhaps their warmth, their diversity, or simply their undeniable charisma, left her unsettled. But for the Johnsons, this moment was about hope. They had no idea that this seemingly idyllic neighborhood would soon test their resilience in ways they had never imagined. What happens when a neighbor decides to disrupt harmony? Mrs. Thompson takes her first step, and tensions begin to rise. But how will the Johnsons respond? Stay tuned as the true face of Maplewood Heights begins to reveal itself. As the barbecue continued in full swing, Mrs. Thompson's unease bubbled over. Her home, perched strategically at the corner of the cul-de-sac, gave her a commanding view of the Johnsons' yard. The laughter, the music, the mingling of people she didn't quite know. Each sound felt like an affront to her carefully curated sense of order. She sat at her dining table, her lips pressed into a thin line, contemplating her next move. Inside her meticulously decorated living room, a sense of superiority mingled with prejudice. Mrs. Thompson had lived in Maplewood Heights for over 30 years and saw herself as the guardian of its values. To her, the Johnson family's energy and openness were not a welcome change. They were a disruption. She muttered to herself, "This is not the way things are done around here," as she picked up her phone. Across the street, the barbecue showed no signs of winding down. Michael flipped burgers with practiced ease, while Rachel served her signature potato salad. The kids laughed as they raced around the yard, their joy infectious. It wasn't long before neighbors began to warm to the Johnsons, trading jokes and sharing stories. For a brief moment, it seemed like the Johnsons had successfully started to carve a place for themselves in Maplewood Heights. But then, the police arrived. The flashing lights and the sound of a siren pierced the festive atmosphere, bringing everything to a sudden halt. A hush fell over the gathering as two officers stepped out of their patrol car, their expressions unreadable. Michael, ever the professional, immediately stepped forward to greet them. "Good evening, officers. Is there a problem?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. "We received a noise complaint," one officer replied, his voice clipped. Michael's experience as a police captain gave him an edge in handling situations like this. He quickly explained that the barbecue was a friendly neighborhood gathering and assured the officers that everything was under control. The officers exchanged glances, seemingly satisfied, and left without incident. But the damage had been done. The festive mood was shattered, replaced by an air of awkwardness and unease. The neighbors began to trickle out, muttering polite goodbyes. Rachel's smile faltered as she began cleaning up, her earlier enthusiasm replaced by quiet disappointment. From her window, Mrs. Thompson watched with a sense of grim satisfaction. She believed she had sent a clear message. This was her neighborhood, and she would not tolerate disturbances, real or imagined. Michael and Rachel sat together on their porch that evening, reflecting on the night's events. They knew this was more than just a noise complaint. It was a warning, a declaration of the battle that lay ahead. Michael reached for Rachel's hand and said, "We knew this wouldn't be easy, but we're not backing down. Not now, not ever." Next, Mrs. Thompson escalates her efforts, and the Johnsons begin to see the true extent of her influence. But Michael and Rachel refuse to stand down. How will they navigate the growing hostility while holding on to their values? The day after the barbecue, the Johnsons began to notice subtle signs that all was not well in Maplewood Heights. It started with sideways glances from passers-by, then hesitant waves that faded as quickly as they appeared. The neighbors who had laughed and chatted with them the night before now seemed guarded, as if they had been warned to keep their distance. Mrs. Thompson, emboldened by her success in disrupting the barbecue, wasted no time rallying her closest allies. She held an impromptu gathering in her living room, inviting a handful of like-minded neighbors to discuss what she called preserving the character of Maplewood Heights. Her rhetoric was thinly veiled, dripping with coded language. She spoke of respecting traditions and maintaining community standards. Her words resonated with some, particularly those who shared her fear of change. Others, however, listened uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond, but unwilling to challenge her outright. Meanwhile, the Johnsons remained unaware of the gathering storm. Rachel continued her efforts to connect with neighbors, dropping off baked goods and offering friendly conversation. Michael, ever observant, began to notice the shift in the community's demeanor. "Something's changed," he said one evening. "I can feel it." Rachel nodded, her optimism tinged with worry. "We'll keep trying," she said. "People will see who we really are." But Mrs. Thompson was determined to ensure that didn't happen. She began circulating a petition, claiming it was for neighborhood safety. Under the guise of introducing stricter community guidelines, she aimed to limit gatherings like the Johnsons' barbecue. She knocked on doors, using her long-standing reputation to sway hesitant neighbors. Some signed without question, trusting her judgment. Others hesitated, but eventually relented, not wanting to cause friction. A few outright refused, their discomfort with her motives growing. Still, Mrs. Thompson pressed on, her resolve unshaken. The Johnsons became aware of the petition when one of the more sympathetic neighbors, a young woman named Claire, confided in them. "I thought you should know," she said. "She's trying to make it harder for you to feel welcome here." Michael listened carefully, his jaw tightening. "Thank you for telling us," he said. "We'll handle this." But Rachel was not content to simply handle it. She saw the petition as a direct attack on their family and decided to push back in her own way. She organized a community cleanup day, inviting everyone to join in beautifying the neighborhood. It was an opportunity to show that they were here to contribute, not to disrupt. The cleanup day was a modest success, drawing a mix of supporters and skeptics. While some neighbors saw it as a genuine gesture, others dismissed it as a ploy. Mrs. Thompson, watching from her porch, scoffed at the sight. "They think they can win people over with a broom and a smile," she muttered. But Rachel refused to be deterred. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," she told Michael that evening. "We're fighting for what's right, for what this neighborhood could be." Coming up, the tensions reach a boiling point as Mrs. Thompson escalates her tactics. But the Johnsons begin to find unexpected allies, setting the stage for a confrontation that will challenge the entire neighborhood. The tension in Maplewood Heights was like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Mrs. Thompson's petition had gained traction, bolstered by her relentless campaigning. Flyers with the neighborhood's unwritten rules began to appear in mailboxes. Printed in neat, bold letters, but heavy with exclusionary undertones. Respect quiet hours, one read. No large gatherings without prior approval, said another. Though they avoided directly naming the Johnsons, the implications were crystal clear. Michael and Rachel, though disheartened, refused to let the pressure crush their spirits. "We're not going to let fear dictate how we live," Michael said firmly as he gathered his family around the dinner table one evening. His voice was calm but resolute, a tone that steadied his children's growing anxiety. Their chance to stand firm came sooner than they expected. A week later, Rachel decided to host a casual get-together for a few new acquaintances she had made during the cleanup day. It wasn't a grand event, just coffee, tea, and conversation in their backyard. Yet even this modest gathering drew Mrs. Thompson's ire. Standing in her window, Mrs. Thompson watched as a handful of neighbors trickled into the Johnsons' yard. Her jaw tightened. She reached for her phone, dialing the police for the second time since the Johnsons moved in. "There's another disturbance at the new family's house," she said curtly. This time, the response was immediate. 2 patrol cars arrived, their lights cutting through the evening twilight. The officers approached the Johnsons' yard, their posture professional but cautious. Michael, ever the professional, stepped forward to address them. "Good evening," Michael began, his voice steady but edged with frustration. "What seems to be the problem?" One of the officers glanced at the gathering. "We received a complaint about a large, noisy party." Michael's brows furrowed. "With all due respect, officers, this is a quiet meeting among neighbors. There's no music, no loud noise, just conversation. I believe this complaint might be misplaced." The officers looked around, clearly noting the calm atmosphere. One of them turned to Michael, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Wait, you're Captain Johnson, right?" Michael nodded. "I am. And while I respect your duty to respond to calls, I hope you'll see there's no disturbance here." The officers exchanged a look, then apologized for the interruption before leaving. As they drove away, murmurs began to ripple through the small group of neighbors who had witnessed the scene. Many were visibly uncomfortable, some even angry. Rachel, always graceful under pressure, stood up and addressed them. "We didn't move here to cause problems. We're here to be part of this community, to contribute to its growth and harmony. But it's clear some people don't want that." Her words hung in the air, a quiet challenge that resonated with those willing to hear it. Claire, the young neighbor who had previously warned the Johnsons about the petition, stepped forward. "This isn't right," she said, her voice firm. "You shouldn't have to defend yourselves like this." It was the first public show of support the Johnsons had received, and it marked a subtle but significant shift in the community's dynamics. That night, as Michael and Rachel reflected on the day's events, they felt a flicker of hope. "It's not just us," Rachel said. "People are starting to see what's really happening here." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "But, Mrs. Thompson won't back down. We have to be ready for whatever comes next." Next, Mrs. Thompson doubles down, using her influence to stir more opposition. But Rachel discovers a hidden truth about the neighborhood's history, leading to a plan that could change everything. The morning after the confrontation, Maplewood Heights felt different. Whispers lingered at mailboxes. Conversations halted as Rachel walked by, and so glances followed Michael's car down the street. While the Johnsons had begun to earn quiet allies like Claire, the battle was far from over. Mrs. Thompson, feeling her authority challenged, decided to escalate her efforts. She convened another meeting at her home, this time inviting an even broader circle of neighbors. Over cookies and coffee, she painted the Johnsons as a disruptive force in the neighborhood, invoking vague references to past families who didn't fit the Maplewood way. She warned her audience that the Johnsons' openness and gatherings would attract the wrong kind of attention, implying that their presence threatened the neighborhood's safety and stability. Mrs. Thompson's words were carefully chosen to stoke fear while maintaining a veneer of respectability. "It's not about them personally," she said, a calculated smile on her lips. It's about keeping Maplewood Heights the safe, peaceful place we've always known. Some neighbors nodded in agreement, their discomfort with the Johnsons manifesting in murmured support. Others fidgeted uneasily, unsure of how to challenge her without becoming targets themselves. Meanwhile, the Johnsons noticed an uptick in subtle but deliberate acts of hostility. Garbage mysteriously appeared on their lawn. An anonymous note was left in their mailbox saying, "Maybe you should consider if this is the right neighborhood for you." Even their children, Maya and Jordan, began to feel the weight of the conflict. Maya, a bright and curious teenager, came home from school one day visibly upset. "Mom," she said hesitantly, "a girl at school said her mom told her we're not real neighbors. What does that even mean?" Rachel's heart ached, but she met her daughter's gaze with unwavering strength. "It means some people are scared of change," she said. "But that doesn't mean we change who we are. We show them through our actions that we belong, just like anyone else." Despite the mounting pressure, the Johnsons remained steadfast. Rachel decided to dig deeper into the history of Maplewood Heights, curious about what had created such a culture of exclusion. What she found both shocked and inspired her. The neighborhood, it turned out, had a long history of resistance to diversity. Old records from community meetings revealed coded language used to maintain its insular nature. Yet, buried in the archives, Rachel also discovered stories of past residents who had fought against these practices, individuals who had quietly challenged the status quo, paving the way for families like hers to eventually move in. Armed with this knowledge, Rachel decided to counter Mrs. Thompson's narrative with facts and history. She and Michael began planning a neighborhood gathering of their own, celebration of the community's untold stories and the diverse contributions of its past and present residents. Mrs. Thompson, however, was not done. She took her campaign to the next level by creating a formal complaint to the neighborhood association, accusing the Johnsons of violating community standards. She hoped to force a hearing that would publicly shame the family and rally more opposition. The Johnsons received the notice a week later. Michael read it aloud at the dinner table, his voice calm but firm. "We're being summoned to a meeting with the neighborhood association," he said. Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Then that's where we'll tell our story," she said. "We're not just defending ourselves, we're standing up for what's right." Next, the Johnsons prepare for the neighborhood association meeting, gathering support and crafting their message. But Mrs. Thompson pulls out all the stops to sway the community. Will the Johnsons' resilience and courage be enough to shift the tide? The neighborhood association meeting was held on a crisp Thursday evening in the local community center. The room was small, with rows of folding chairs arranged in neat lines facing a podium. As the Johnsons entered, they were met with a sea of curious faces, some familiar, others less so. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the room itself held its breath in anticipation. Michael walked in with quiet confidence, his uniform bearing honed by years in law enforcement. Rachel followed, holding her head high, exuding a calm yet determined grace. Behind them were Claire and a handful of neighbors who had chosen to support the Johnsons despite the brewing controversy. At the front of the room stood Mrs. Thompson, flanked by a small group of her staunchest supporters. Her demeanor was as composed as ever, but the glint in her eye revealed her intent. This was her stage, and she intended to wield her influence to full effect. The meeting began with formalities. The head of the neighborhood association, a wiry man named Mr. Daniels, called the gathering to order. "We're here to address a matter of concern raised by Mrs. Thompson," he said. "The topic is community standards and whether recent activities align with our neighborhood's guidelines." Mrs. Thompson took the floor first. She spoke with practiced authority, laying out her grievances with precision. "It's not about the Johnson family personally," she said, her tone dripping with feigned civility. "It's about maintaining the peace and order of our community. Large gatherings, excessive noise, and disregard for our unspoken rules disrupt what we've worked so hard to build here." Her words were met with nods from her supporters and uneasy silence from others. When it was Michael's turn to speak, He approached the podium with measured steps, pausing to look around the room. "Thank you for allowing me to address this," he began, his voice steady. "I've served as a police officer for over 20 years. In that time, I've seen many communities, each with their own challenges and strengths. I can tell you this: a community isn't defined by its rules or traditions. It's defined by the way it treats its members." His words hung in the air, drawing murmurs from the audience. Rachel stepped forward to join him, holding a folder filled with documents she had spent weeks compiling. "I'd like to share something with you," she said. "This neighborhood has a history, and not all of it is as harmonious as we like to believe. But within that history are stories of people who stood up for inclusion and progress. That's the legacy we want to continue, not division, but unity." She opened the folder and began sharing stories of past residents who had fought for equality, weaving a narrative that connected their struggles to the Johnsons' present situation. Her words were impassioned, yet poised, striking a chord with many in the room. One by one, a few neighbors began to stand up in support of the Johnsons. Claire spoke first, her voice clear and unwavering. "I've gotten to know the Johnsons, and they're good people. This isn't about noise or gatherings. It's about whether we're willing to welcome change and grow as a community." Others followed, their courage bolstered by the Johnsons' example. The tide in the room began to shift, with murmurs of agreement replacing the earlier tension. Mrs. Thompson, sensing her influence waning, attempted a final rebuttal. "This isn't about resistance to change," she insisted, her composure cracking. "It's about preserving the integrity of our neighborhood." But the room was no longer hers to command. Michael closed with a simple but powerful statement. "We're here to build a future, not just for our family, but for everyone in Maplewood Heights. We're not leaving, and we're not giving up on this community." The meeting ended with no definitive resolution, but the Johnsons had clearly gained ground. As they walked out, neighbors who had once been silent approached to offer words of support. Next, the fallout from the meeting ripples through Maplewood Heights. Mrs. Thompson faces unexpected resistance, while the Johnsons begin to see the fruits of their perseverance. But a deeper truth about Mrs. Thompson's motivations comes to light, setting the stage for a transformative moment. In the days following the neighborhood association meeting, Maplewood Heights was abuzz with conversations. The Johnsons' words had sparked a shift in perception, forcing many neighbors to confront uncomfortable truths about their community. The petition Mrs. Thompson had so diligently circulated began to lose its momentum as people reevaluated their support. Claire and a small group of other neighbors took it upon themselves to counter Mrs. Thompson's narrative. They organized informal gatherings to discuss the meeting and what it revealed about the neighborhood's culture. These discussions brought together residents who, like the Johnsons, wanted Maplewood Heights to be a place of inclusion and progress. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson retreated into her home, her influence visibly shaken. Her usual air of control was replaced by an edge of desperation. She watched as neighbors who had once aligned with her began to distance themselves. Even her closest allies seemed hesitant to continue their public support. But Mrs. Thompson was not one to accept defeat easily. She began digging into the Johnsons' background, hoping to find something she could use against them. She scoured public records and reached out to old acquaintances, but her search turned up nothing. The Johnsons were, by all accounts, exactly who they appeared to be: hardworking, community-oriented, and honest. As Mrs. Thompson's efforts grew more frantic, Rachel's research into the neighborhood's history uncovered something unexpected. Among the archives, she found records linking Mrs. Thompson's family to some of the same exclusionary practices that had defined Maplewood Heights in its earlier days. These records painted a picture of a legacy steeped in fear of change and resistance to diversity. Rachel shared her findings with Michael and Claire. "This isn't just about us," she said. "This is about a mindset that's been passed down for generations. If we can confront it, maybe we can start to change it." Claire, emboldened by Rachel's determination, took the lead in organizing a neighborhood forum. The forum, billed as a celebration of Maplewood Heights' history and future, was designed to bring residents together to discuss what kind of community they wanted to build. The Johnsons were invited to share their story, and Rachel saw it as an opportunity to highlight the parallels between the past and the present. When news of the forum reached Mrs. Thompson, she saw it as a direct challenge. In her mind, the Johnsons were attempting to undermine her position as the unofficial steward of the neighborhood. Determined to reassert her authority, she decided to attend the forum, believing she could steer the narrative back in her favor. The night of the forum, the community center was packed. Residents of all ages filled the room, eager to hear what would be said. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, a stark contrast to the division that had characterized recent weeks. Rachel spoke first, sharing the stories she had uncovered about the neighborhood's past. "We've all inherited a history," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "The question is, what do we want to leave behind for the next generation? Fear and division, or understanding and unity?" Michael followed, recounting the challenges their family had faced since moving in. He spoke of resilience, of choosing to believe in the possibility of change, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. His words were met with applause, a sign that the Johnsons' message was resonating. When Mrs. Thompson stood to speak, the room fell silent. Her usual composure was replaced by a visible unease. She began by defending her actions, reiterating her belief in preserving the character of the neighborhood. But as she spoke, it became clear that her argument was losing its power. One resident stood and challenged her directly. "Mrs. Thompson, isn't it time we move past these old divisions? This isn't about preserving the neighborhood. It's about keeping people out. That's not who we want to be anymore." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Mrs. Thompson, for the first time, seemed at a loss for words. She looked around, realizing that her once loyal supporters were no longer backing her. As the forum concluded, the Johnsons were surrounded by neighbors offering apologies, support, and gratitude. The tide had finally turned, and Maplewood Heights was beginning to redefine itself. Next, Mrs. Thompson faces the consequences of her actions as the neighborhood moves toward reconciliation. The Johnsons take on a leadership role in fostering change. But will Mrs. Thompson accept this new direction, or will she remain resistant? The day after the forum, the air in Maplewood Heights felt lighter, as if a collective exhale had swept through the community. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact with the Johnsons now stopped to chat, offering kind words and gestures of solidarity. Small but meaningful changes were taking root. For Michael and Rachel, the shift was heartening, but they knew that real progress required more than a single meeting or a few apologies. Change, they understood, had to be nurtured deliberately and consistently. They began brainstorming ways to foster ongoing dialogue and build a stronger sense of unity among the neighbors. Their first initiative was to create a neighborhood committee focused on inclusion and community engagement. The committee would organize events, mediate disputes, and ensure that everyone felt heard and valued. Claire eagerly joined the effort, bringing her energy and fresh ideas to the table. Other neighbors, inspired by the Johnsons' resilience, volunteered to help as well. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson's world had grown quiet. The backlash from the forum had left her isolated, her influence diminished. She spent most days inside her home, avoiding the neighbors she had once controlled so effortlessly. But even in her solitude, she couldn't ignore the changes happening around her. One afternoon, Rachel decided to visit Mrs. Thompson. "Are you sure about this?" Michael asked, concern evident in his voice. "Yes," Rachel replied firmly. "If we want this neighborhood to heal, we can't leave anyone behind, not even her." When Rachel knocked on Mrs. Thompson's door, it took a few moments before it opened. Mrs. Thompson stood in the doorway, her expression guarded. "What do you want?" she asked curtly. "I came to talk," Rachel said, her tone calm but resolute. "Not to argue, but to listen." Mrs. Thompson hesitated before stepping aside to let Rachel in. They sat across from each other in the living room, the silence between them heavy with years of unspoken tension. Rachel began by sharing her perspective. She spoke of the challenges her family had faced, not just in Maplewood Heights, but throughout their lives. She acknowledged Mrs. Thompson's fears, even if she didn't agree with them. "I know change is hard," Rachel said, "but it's also necessary. It's what allows us to grow." Mrs. Thompson listened, her expression softening as Rachel spoke. For the first time, she opened up about her own fears of losing her sense of control, of seeing her neighborhood transform into something she no longer recognized. "I thought I was protecting this community," she admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "But maybe I was just protecting myself." The conversation ended on a tentative note of understanding. While Mrs. Thompson didn't fully embrace the changes taking place, she agreed to step back and give the neighborhood a chance to evolve. Over the next few months, Maplewood Heights blossomed into a more inclusive and vibrant community. The neighborhood committee hosted block parties, cleanup days, and cultural celebrations, each event drawing a larger and more diverse crowd. The Johnsons became a central part of these efforts, their leadership and kindness earning them the respect and admiration of their neighbors. Even Mrs. Thompson began to reemerge, attending a few events and engaging in small talk with neighbors. Though her transformation was slow and imperfect, it was a sign that even the most entrenched beliefs could begin to shift under the right circumstances. For the Johnsons, the journey had been far from easy, but it had been worth it. They had faced prejudice and adversity with dignity and perseverance, proving that change was possible when people chose courage over fear and connection over division. Thank you for watching this story of resilience, transformation, and hope. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and explore more stories of overcoming challenges and building community. Your support helps us share these important messages. See you in the next video.